The cameras had barely started rolling when the smirk appeared on the host's face. It was subtle but unmistakable. The kind of smirk that said, "I've got something clever and cutting, and you won't see it coming." Karoline Leavitt sat poised in her seat, wearing a simple cross necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. To her, it was more than jewelry. It was a symbol of her roots, her faith, and the quiet strength that had carried her through the storms of political life. But to the host, it seemed, it was a prop, something to belittle, to use for a punchline. The moment came halfway through the segment. The topic was supposed to be the state of the nation, economic policy, generational leadership, the role of faith in public service, but instead the host leaned forward and said with a grin, "Tell me, Karoline, does that little cross help you make policy decisions, or is it just for show?" The studio chuckled. A few staffers smirked behind the cameras. The jab had been made. And in a world where mocking faith was becoming fashionable, it landed like a calculated blow. There was a pause, a deep, uncomfortable silence, the kind that stretched across television screens and living rooms and felt like a collective breath being held. But Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't fire back with rage or sarcasm. She didn't storm off or call for an apology. Instead, she smiled softly, not the smile of someone defeated, but of someone who knew who she was. And then she said something no one expected. "I wear this cross," she began, her voice steady but strong, "because it reminds me of the nights I watched my mother cry when my dad lost his job. It reminds me of my grandfather who fought in World War II with it tucked in his pocket, praying he'd come home to his bride. And it reminds me every single day that I answer to something greater than polls or ratings. I answer to truth, to love, to sacrifice, and yes, to God." The laughter died instantly. The room shifted. You could feel it, the weight of truth hitting like thunder. Even the host, so confident just seconds earlier, faltered. "Well, I didn't mean to," he began, but Karoline lifted her hand gently and continued. "I'm not ashamed of my faith, not because it makes me better, but because it makes me braver. I've stood in rooms where I was the only one who believed in something more. I've had doors slammed in my face and my values mocked. But I've also seen what happens when one voice stands firm. It gives others permission to do the same. I don't wear this cross for attention. I wear it to remember that even when I'm alone, I'm not truly alone." That clip, just 2 minutes long, went viral within hours. It raced through social media, cutting across political lines, igniting conversations in churches, schools, and coffee shops. Some dismissed it as scripted, others called it brave, but to millions it was a rare and raw moment of conviction in a culture starving for authenticity. It was someone standing firm, not with anger, but with grace. Messages began pouring in. A teenage girl in Texas wrote, "I wore my cross again today, thank you." A single mom in Michigan said, "I've been mocked at work for my beliefs. You reminded me not to back down." Even a few critics reached out privately, admitting that they'd been shaken, not by anger or clever arguments, but by quiet courage. And yet, the real storm hadn't even started. 2 days later, Karoline received an invitation to return to the same show. The producers knew they had lightning in a bottle. But when she stepped back onto the stage, she wasn't there to gloat. Instead, she brought with her a letter, one written by a young man from California who had been watching that original broadcast with a loaded gun beside him. He had planned to end his life that night, convinced no one in the world stood for anything real anymore. But something in Karoline's words stopped him. "You reminded me that there's still something sacred," he wrote. "You reminded me to hold on, she read the letter aloud on live television. By the end, even the host who had mocked her was wiping away tears. Karoline Leavitt didn't change the world in one interview, but she reminded it of something it had forgotten, that faith isn't weakness and grace isn't silence, that real strength often looks like standing still when the storm rages, and that sometimes the quiet power of conviction is louder than any insult. In the weeks that followed, others began speaking up. Politicians, artists, students, teachers, people who had felt alone in their values, unsure if there was still room in the world for quiet belief. They began to speak, not with vengeance, but with vision, not to dominate, but to declare, I too believe, and I will not be mocked into silence. Karoline's story became a ripple in a culture desperate for depth, not because she fought back, but because she stood firm, because she responded not with fists, but with faith, not with revenge, but with resilience. And in doing so, she didn't just defend a symbol, she reminded a nation how powerful it can be when one person refuses to be ashamed of what anchors them, even when the cameras roll, the crowd laughs, and the critics pounce. Because sometimes all it takes to shift the world is one unshaken voice.